Hello and welcome to another episode of On Books. This is Chris here, recording from New York City. And this week I have author and philosopher Peter Singer here on the show. Peter has written 2 books in our ongoing social good books series. So we put together this list of social good books. I'm trying to answer this itch that I have of how do I make sense of doing good in the world? What does it mean to do good? And really, there's no better person to talk to than Peter Singer. He has been writing about this subject since the 70s. He's really well known as a philosopher and an author. In the 70s, he wrote this book, Animal Liberation, which was a highly influential book in the animal rights community. Probably anything that you've seen, probably anyone that you know who is a vegetarian or involved in animal rights in some way indirectly was probably affected by his writing back then, because it was so influential and one of the first of its kind to speak up about the ethics of how we treat animals. In 2005, Time magazine named Peter Singer one of the top 100 most influential people of the year. And recently, he has been writing about the effective altruist movement, to which he kicked off and started. The effective altruist movement, giving more effectively. How can everyone in the world give a little bit and set in motion this self-saving world? Peter is an inspiration to me in that he's opened my eyes to, the idea that by giving a little bit of money to the right causes can be enough to save a human life, and what that means, that whole cycle, and the everyday things that I don't necessarily pay attention to, that I have the privilege of blocking out of my sight. These things in the world, and he's really brought that to the forefront with his writing, made it accessible for me and for I think a general audience. And he put together a site, thelifeyoucansave.org, which we'll chat about, which really has just some clear steps that kind of answered some of the how do I give, what does it mean to give, how do I know my money's going where it's most effective. Like, this is what he's working on, and I think it's an amazing cause. And I think that after reading his work and hopefully after listening to this conversation, I think that there's a case to be made. I'm like, wow, it's like superpowers. It's like, really, if I give $5 to this cause, I can save someone's life. I mean, that is, in a way, that's what, I mean, geez, you're like Superman at that point, right? Or at least that's how I felt. So it's really cool to bring kind of my concerns and, after reading these books, after talking about them in the 2 previous episodes, to Peter and get his take on it, get, where he's coming from, his origin story, and some actionable steps to set in motion good things in the world. All right. So that's where we're at. So in this episode, we'll chat about what it means to do the most good in the world. We'll talk about ways that startups can be effective in doing more good. I'll ask him about what it was like to be one of the first animal rights writers and activists back in the 70s. And I was curious also, when did he get the idea that he could be someone who changes the world? I mean, do you just wake up one day and you're like, I'm going to change the world. I'm going to dedicate my life to doing good and writing about it. So we get that story as well. I start off with a question, this quote actually from E.B. White that you may have heard about. And so that's what you're going to hear me reading to him right at the front of the phone call. I was like, all right, Peter, let's get into it. There's this quote on my mind about doing good and waking up in the world that you, the listeners, you may have heard of me read before. If not, it's coming up. And we get right into it. How do I make sense of waking up in the morning and being conflicted with doing good and enjoying my day? It drives me nuts, and Peter has a good answer for it. So that and so much more coming. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with me and Peter Singer. I read this quote by E.B. White, and I want to read it to you now. And it says, I wake up in the morning torn between a desire to improve the world and a desire to enjoy the world. And this makes it hard to plan the day. You ever heard that quote before?
No, I haven't. It's a new one to me. I guess my first comment is, why assume that you can't do both? Why assume that improving the world is not in itself a very rewarding and fulfilling thing to do. I think we tend to have this idea that I'm going to do something that I'll enjoy, like whatever it might be, read a book, go to a restaurant, something like that, lie in the sun, and otherwise I'm going to have to do something that's no fun at all to help other people, work in a soup kitchen, and so on. But in fact, there's lots of studies that show that people who help others, who think about others, who are generous, enjoy their lives more than people who don't think about others. So I want to challenge that dichotomy, that it's one or the other that is implied in that quote.
Well, I think all right, that's a good take on it. And I think some of the places where I get stuck is it seems like I'm being selfish, though. Like if I'm, I don't know, playing tennis or if I'm taking an improv class, it seems like then these kind of things are purely for myself. And like, where do we find the balance? Do I put in, because I see what you're saying, like there can be things that are for both, but how do I do both? How do I do that?
And, you can't answer that question in general for everyone. People have different ways of living, but, if tennis is your way of getting some exercise and having some fun and relaxing, then good. That's probably a good thing for you to do that will keep you healthy and fit and enjoying your life. So I'm certainly not going to say that you have to work 24/7 at doing good for others directly. I think you can see looking after yourself as part of a larger plan in which you are going to do more good on the whole over your lifetime. Having said that, obviously there are some things that you might be carrying it too far. If you spend all day, every day playing tennis just for the fun of it, or if you're spending 5 hours every evening sitting on the sofa watching sitcoms, then probably there is more good you could be doing with your time, and quite possibly you'd be enjoying it more as well.
So what does a day in the life of Peter Singer look like?
Well, lately it has involved quite a lot of time sitting at my computer because I'm writing a book about utilitarianism. And I hope the book itself will do some good and encourage people to take what I see as the right ethical approach to life. Also, obviously, it will earn me a little bit of money, which I'll then be able to give some of that away to charities that are doing good. But I do always make sure that I get some exercise, that I get outside, that I do something that's a bit fun, depending on where I am and what weather is like. I might be going for a walk with my wife. I might be going surfing if I'm in Australia now, and it's kind of getting a little cool for it. The summer's over, but for the last few months I've been in the ocean a bit. That's a great way of getting outdoors, relaxing, and having fun. So I spend a lot of time working, but I'm certainly not doing that all the time. And obviously, sometimes I'm doing things like talking to you to try and spread the message of how you can improve the world and live a rewarding life yourself as well.
Yeah, as part of the effect, and thank you for taking the time and sharing this with me and my audience. We love it. So as part of the effective altruist movement, I see, like when I see the potential of what jobs that someone could have, there's one part of the book that I really like where you're like, you don't have to go work in nonprofits. Actually, that might not be the best way to do it. And I get Will McCaskill, right? He talks a lot about that. He has in his book and his TED Talk, from what I've seen, he's like, you could go work on Wall Street and you can give a portion of your money. I like the approach, and I try to apply that to myself. And sometimes, there's a lot of in between there. Like I'm teaching, and I teach startups. I teach people how to run a business, how to code and design things in some ways. And I don't know, it's just like my own kind of like existential dilemma going back and forth, where in one light I can go, I'm helping people make things and I'm coming from a good place and I'm enjoying it. And after reading your book, I'm really trying to open my mind to charity, and like I'm trying, but at the same time, like, is that enough? Like, should I go and work at an agency, or should I go work on Wall Street, or am I overthinking it? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about what you're doing and what good it's achieving, and whether some of that, I mean, if you're teaching people to be successful with a startup, you may be teaching them to provide a service which can make a big difference, as obviously some startups have greatly improved life, and not only for people in rich nations, but for people in developing nations as well. Some people have run startups which perhaps didn't really make a big difference to the world in terms of the business they're running, but they've got wealthy, and then they've used some of the money that they've earned for good purposes. So maybe that's part of your message in teaching people about startups, that they shouldn't just think about themselves. I know there's something called the Founders Forum you might be familiar with. I'm
No, I don't
speaking at a
know it.
meeting. Yeah, they're having a meeting in London in June that I'm speaking at, and I think they're basically founders of startups who've pledged to give 2% of their profits to charities, and so that's, as some of these people are very wealthy, that's significant amounts of money. So maybe that's a part of what you're talking about as well. You could be doing a great deal of good in terms of that teaching, and then you'd have to compare that with what you would do if you were simply to say, where can I earn the most money, and then give a substantial part of that money to effective charities. It's always going to depend on the particular facts of any individual circumstances.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to think about it, and it still gives me a little bit of like uneasiness, because I don't know. I just feel like I think I'm just really analytical, and I'm like, could I be working harder? Or I don't know. And at the same time, I'm like, but I kind of want to go on vacation, and I do. You know what I mean? And like, I feel like I don't know if it was you that said it or one of the people. It was quoted in one of your books, but there was like somebody who they like try not to go on vacation. I think it was part of their story, because
It's not me. I certainly take vacations. I think as I said, I do work pretty hard, quite long hours
yeah.
at times. I do think that I need a break, and certainly in terms of my wife will complain about not spending time with her, and that's a really important relationship for me. So it's a way that we get to spend some time together. We go somewhere, do some hiking somewhere, something of that sort. I think I think it is part of being there for the long haul.
Yeah, that's a good like holistic, healthy way to approach things. I dig that. It's good to hear. It's good to hear it from you, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
When you were growing up, when was the moment when you realized that you were passionate about the field of doing good? I don't believe it was called effective altruism until more recently, but when did it strike you?
It wasn't when I was very young, I have to say. I sort of originally, when I was growing up, I didn't particularly think about doing good. I guess I thought about going into politics a bit, and in a way that's doing good, but of course it's also being ambitious and so on. I didn't end up, I didn't really seriously end up doing that. I then started studying philosophy more or less by accident, because it seemed like something interesting that I'd heard about from a boyfriend of my sister. In philosophy, though, there are some areas of philosophy which are interesting intellectual problems, but really have nothing to do with your life. Like, how do I know that I'm not dreaming right now? It's an interesting question, but nobody's really going to say, "Oh, I'm going to live my life very differently," because I can't eliminate the possibility that this is a kind of very complex dream, or perhaps some evil demon has hallucinated me, or whatever. Maybe I'm in the Matrix. You can't really live your life differently on that basis. But clearly there are areas of philosophy, ethics and political philosophy, that do make a difference to how you're going to live. So I moved towards them because they seem to me to be more significant and something that you could talk to other people outside philosophy about. And then once I was in that area, there came a point when I started thinking that this does have some application to how you live. And that might sound totally obvious if you're doing ethics, but in the 1960s, when I was starting to do this, really philosophy was mostly about analyzing the meanings of words. It wasn't. In fact, philosophers specifically disavowed the idea that they might be a source of guidance on how you ought to live. I think that was a mistake, but it was a mistake that was around when I was an undergraduate. And then gradually at the end of the 60s, students started demanding more relevance from their courses as part of the anti-war and civil rights movements. And it was at that point that it became possible to sort of start to talk about ethics in conjunction with how we ought to live. And a couple of things then led me to really focus on that very particularly. One of them was learning about the way animals are treated in factory farms. I was a meat eater at the time. I'd grown up in Australia, which was a country that was, big meat eating country, producing a lot of beef. Meat was cheap. And I hadn't questioned that. I hadn't really thought about attitudes to animals at all. Very few people did then take that as a serious issue. But I did more or less because of an accidental encounter with someone who was telling me about factory farming, and so I decided that I ought not to eat animals.
Wow.
Which is much more, less common stance than it is today. And so obviously at that point, then ethics is having a major effect on your life. I mean, every day you're making decisions about what to eat and what not to eat. That for me came directly from basically thinking about ethics and how ought we to be treating animals. And from there, pretty soon I got into the question of also global poverty and what we ought to be doing about that.
So you said a friend showed you about factory farming back in, I'm guessing this was like the early 70s. And
yes, that's right. Yes, it was, I think it was 1970.
And is that what affected you?
Student, I'd gone to Oxford. I'd left Australia and gone to Oxford to do my graduate studies, and he was a Canadian graduate student, a guy called Richard Keshen, who was a vegetarian, and that was pretty unusual to meet a vegetarian, especially a vegetarian who was like not an Indian for whom it was a sort of cultural thing. It was not a health nut who, thought that, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a nutty belief now, but it seemed like a nutty belief at the time to think that eating meat was going to be bad for you. But Richard was a kind of ethical vegetarian because of the way animals were treated, and that was a absolutely pivotal meeting for me. I think that it certainly changed my life.
Did people think you were crazy?
Well, I'm sure some did, yeah.
I went through it in the 90s when I became vegetarian when I was 16, and that was in the 90s. And I was the only kid in my school. I had seen an HBO documentary, which I cannot for the life of me remember the name. Maybe it was inspired by your book even, but it really affected me. And it was really hard. So yeah, I could only imagine, 20 years before that in the 70s, what was that like?
Yeah, well, the leading vegetarian restaurant in London at the time was called Cranks, and that, I guess, indicates what people thought of vegetarians, that they were cranks. they were nuts in some way.
The British humor. So funny.
Yeah, right. But it was unusual, and certainly some of our friends thought that we'd become strange. Somebody said, "Have you become Puritans?" Like as if somehow, this was a sort of self-denying thing, like not having alcohol. And it was quite hard to get vegetarian food around. There, the sorts of things, the sorts of substitutes that exist now. You can walk into a supermarket and there's a great array of plant-based meat substitutes. At that stage, there was one kind of textured vegetable protein, which was really pretty indigestible, I have to say. We used it for a while just because it meant we could keep using the same recipes, recipes like beef stroganoff or something that had chunks of beef in it. You could substitute these chunks of this stuff called proto-veg, but was pretty bad.
I've never had that. Uh, um, Amazing. So at the time, then you think I'm putting together what my interpretation of when you released Animal Liberation back in '75 was that your way of saying this is going to be the greatest good I can do is to release this book and share this with other people. Like people don't know this. Is that kind of where you were coming from? Like this is
Yes,
new.
that's pretty much right. I mean, I didn't perhaps put it then in terms of the greatest good I can do, but but it did seem to me that this was a completely neglected issue on which a book of the kind that I wrote could do a lot of good. There were many issues around at the time that I was very concerned with. It wasn't that I was saying the treatment of animals is the major issue of our time. This was still the Vietnam War was still going on. Racism was a problem. Global poverty was a problem. And I could have said any of those issues are at least as important as the way we treat animals. But the difference was that there were lots of good people writing about those questions. You only had to pick up a copy of the New York Review of Books, which was kind of the leading progressive magazine at the time, and you would get many, great people writing about those kinds of questions. And I didn't think that I necessarily had something distinctive to contribute. But you couldn't find anyone writing about the treatment of animals. There were some societies that put out literature. It was mostly about dogs and cats. It was, there would be very cute pictures of puppies and kittens, and then there would be a plea to give money to stop them being abused or used in experiments or something of that sort. Pretty much nobody was talking about factory farming. There was one exception, an English campaigner called Ruth Harrison, who'd written a book about it, but the book was published by a small publisher and got very little attention. I thought this was something that I could contribute to that issue, and hoped that it would change the way we treat animals. I think it did to some extent. Not dramatically as I'd hoped, but I think in the long run it has made a difference.
Yeah, I sometimes as I get older, I feel like change just takes a lot of time. I think when I was younger, and when I was in college, I would just maybe get really frustrated that things wouldn't. You'd go to a few protests or read a book or two, and I guess I expected the world was going to change overnight. Are you still hopeful that change takes time and that things are getting better than that they were?
Yeah, I definitely think that they're getting better. At least they're getting better in most countries. If we're talking about animals, say in Europe and North America and here in Australia, they're getting somewhat better. I have an article in a very recent issue of the New York Review of Books. In fact, I've gone back to writing that, called "Open the Cages," reviewing a book by Wayne Purcell, the president of the Humane Society of the United States, a book called "The Humane Economy," which I think indicates the way in which, even through the corporate structures of corporations like McDonald's and Walmart's, they are, because of consumer pressure, starting to improve their requirements for how animals be treated, the animals whose bodies they serve. And that's definitely a good thing. Of course, in parts of Asia, in China, for example, meat consumption is increasing dramatically, and that's all produced by factory farming. So there's very bad things happening as well. But I do see signs of progress.
This is great. One thing that I haven't read all your works yet, but one thing that I haven't seen or haven't heard you speak about is just the concept of voting with your dollar, the concept of the actions, the things that we buy or the things that we're creating, and how that might affect doing greater good in the world. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I talked a bit about that in a book called The Ethics of What We Eat, with Jim Mason, where I talked about voting with your dollar in terms of the food you buy, not only in terms of reducing animal suffering, but also in terms of climate change, fair trade, those kinds of issues. And I do think that voting with your dollar is important. I think you can make a difference. And we really ought to be buying products with a lower carbon footprint, which again will point to avoiding meat products. We ought to be trying to support people in developing countries, and that may point to buying fair trade products. So I think that's important. And if we have consumer practices that help to produce a better world, that's definitely one way of making a difference.
Yeah, because sometimes I'm curious if that stuff adds up. There was I read something where like one hamburger equals 20 showers or 100 showers. I don't remember the exact statistic. Just the amount of water that it takes to feed the cattle, and it's just kind of shocking sometimes because you might think, yeah, I'm taking shorter showers, like I'm doing, in California. I think this was coming from, I think I'm doing something to improve the drought out there, but then you find out a statistic like that, and it kind of blows the lid off. So specifically after hearing that, it made me question a little bit of the things, whether I'm like not taking a bag when to carry my own bag, or these buying decisions, or not to eat meat. And it just started to make me question the relative weight that certain decisions, because if I'm like, struggling with quotes around it to like be so super conscious of all these things, and then like one, hamburger or one other thing is going to blow it out of proportion, it kind of just, I don't know, I guess it makes me feel kind of like empty about it, or like it could blow out the steam.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is important to know which is making the bigger difference, I think, but definitely in terms of water consumption, meat is a major user, and dairy as well. In terms of climate change, which is, of course, a much bigger and I think ultimately, more significant global issue, then meat is a major factor, which at the moment is not being sufficiently considered. So people will think about not driving, riding a bike, using public transport. They're all good things to do. Or if you do have to drive, using a fuel-efficient hybrid. But the amount of meat that you consume is probably going to make a bigger difference than any of those things. So that is important. But at the same time, I kind of agree that you don't have to spend a huge amount of time being absolutely fanatical about these things, or being saying that you've got to be totally pure. And if you do, you might be spending so much time that you could be doing more effective things by being an active citizen and getting involved politically, or for that matter, going back to what we were talking about before, earning more money and therefore donating more money to organizations that are trying to advocate for what you're wanting to do, or organizations that are trying to help people in extreme poverty.
That's great. I mean, that really helps kind of balance my thoughts. I like that a lot. That's awesome. Before we close out, Peter, the one question which I ask all guests is, if you had one book that you wish everyone would read, what would it be?
Yeah, it's actually, because I've written on these different issues, and we've already talked about animal liberation, which is certainly one book that I would like everyone to read. But is it the book I would like everyone to read now? I'm not sure. I would certainly like everyone to read The Most Good You Can Do, which is the book in which I talk about effective altruism, and I give examples of effective altruists and the kinds of lives that they are leading, and that relates to many of the things we've just been talking about, many of those questions about how can you really be most effective and do the most good in the world. So probably actually that, if I have to just single out one at the moment, I'll say The Most Good You Can Do. I've also written a book called The Life You Can Save a few years earlier, more specifically about global poverty. And that led to the founding of an organization called The Life You Can Save, which people can go to online and look about, find stuff about global poverty and which are the effective charities that are making a difference there. So that would be a third possibility, but I guess I only get one choice. So
well,
the most good you can do.
Well, I have good news. We've talked about in the previous episode before this, we spoke about both of those books. I gave some highlights about why I came to them and how they have really informed my thinking. So hopefully they pick those up, and hopefully people listening right now are also tuned to those names and have heard them before. So I'm glad we agree.
Great. That's terrific.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is there anything else that we can do, that our audience, anyone listening, can do besides reading your books? Is there any kind of closing advice, anything you'd like to plug, a website or something that we should check out?
Yeah, well, as I say, go to thelifeyoucansave.org. I think that's really got a lot of information there about what you can do to be an effective altruist, to help do your part in helping people in extreme poverty who are less fortunate than you are. That's probably one. If you're interested in helping animal-related charities, there's something called Animal Charity Evaluators. You can Google them, and that will give you recommendations about effective animal charities as well.
It's fascinating. This is wonderful. Well, Peter, I think you're doing a tremendous good in the world, and I'm so inspired. I'm so glad that I came across your books and that we had a chance to chat. I feel great about this.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks for spreading the word.
Yeah, for sure, Peter. That was Peter Singer. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can learn more about The Life You Can Save by going to thelifeyoucansave.org. I went there immediately after this chat with Peter, and it is so easy to give money and to see where it's going and to feel part of something. So that was my experience, and I'm really grateful for the site and all the work Peter has been doing. So give that a try. Give it a check it out. You don't have to, do anything crazy. You don't have to do anything too crazy, but you could at least check it out and find out, what's going on there. And if it does tickle you, if it does feel good, maybe that's something that is interesting to you as far as giving more good in the world. And so I got tickled. What can I say? That's what I'm saying. I guess that's pretty much what I'm saying. If you want to read more from Peter, The Life You Can Save, of the books that he mentioned, that one was my favorite. I just think it really handled a lot of the common objections to giving and doing more good in the world. And I think by thinking through those, I could more critically decide for myself what I wanted to do after reading the book. So check that book out. It's a thin, small, it's like a summer read. It could be a summer read. Also, it is an On Books episode from a few episodes ago, both of the books we mentioned. So I cover those in about 20, 30 minutes, some of the big takeaways. And one point of clarification here. So eating one hamburger equals 2 months of showering. I got that number wrong when I was chatting with Peter. So eating one hamburger, the amount of beef in there, to make that beef takes the amount of water that you give to the cow of leaving the shower on 4 minutes a day for 2 months. That's the statistic. And that and many more statistics like that are from cowspiracy.com/facts. And it's eye-opening that it takes 2,500 gallons of water to make 1 pound of beef. That's something like half an adult-sized swimming pool. All right, so those are just the facts. I see this information is a tool, and this is something that we can use to inform ourselves, get both sides, get all sides of what it takes to do more good, what it takes to be a human, to feed a human, to be all the things, making this kind of storyline here so that I can make better decisions, and together as a community, we can do that. So thank you for listening. I mean, I think just putting this out there and getting this information from me has been a challenge and a cool journey over the past few weeks. So thanks for coming along for that. If you like On Books, please subscribe. You can subscribe for free on iTunes. Also, tell a friend or two. It helps the show if you tweet it or Facebook, like the Facebook page /OnBooksShow, or I'm on Twitter @OnBooksShow. All that does really help things out, so I appreciate it. Thank you for doing that. If you have any questions or comments, things you want to tell me, you can write me. I'm chris@on-books.com, and the show notes, all the other links and stuff from this episode and all the previous episodes of On Books are, of course, at on-books.com. So now you are informed. All right, thanks again for listening, and I will talk to you next week. Enjoy.